There are some tried and true combinations that simply go hand in hand. Burgers and fries, tea and biscuits, this channel and barely getting any views. As far as the visual novel medium, titles such as Higurashi, Raging Loop, or Akai Ito have shown how well rural Japan and mystery blend together, thanks to the immersive atmosphere this sort of setting can offer. In this video, I want to highlight another title that aims for a similar goal, mixing tradition and suspense, it being a joint work between Hiyoko Soft and La'cryma. Hey there, this is Miran, and this is my review of Kieta Sekai, Tsuki to Shoujo. The story follows Okina Seiji, who after receiving a letter from his dad, decides to return to his hometown. Up until now, Seiji had been living with his relatives, as his father needed time alone after the sudden death of Seiji's mother. The circumstances of the loss of her mother are still shrouded in mystery, but with this new chance to go back to his home, he's intent on finally finding the truth. After arriving, Seiji quickly gets lost, but he encounters a young girl who offers to guide him. And I'm going to skip just a tiny little plot detail here because I think it's better experienced by yourself. At any rate, he then wakes up in the clinic he had been searching for, since anyone wishing to enter the village must first undergo a medical examination due to an epidemic that occurred years ago. No, not that one. This game was released before 2020. Anyway, he had apparently lost consciousness and was carried there by someone unbeknownst to him. Upon leaving the clinic, he promptly reunites with his childhood friend Mina, who offered him a place to stay, as Seiji's relationship with his father is in a rather rocky state. It doesn't take long for him to meet Mina's friends, some of whom he already knew before leaving years ago, thus spending his days peacefully, completely unaware that the town was hiding a dark secret, one that he and his friends will inevitably be dragged into. At the core of the story lies the group of friends that form the main cast. Their chemistry was entertaining, largely due to their contrasting personalities. I felt, however, that they could have benefited from a few more recurring interactions. The only one that stood out was how Takeru would often and insistently confess to Anzu, jokingly keeping the pretense that the two of them were in a relationship, much to Anzu's annoyance. Beyond that, though, it seemed like most of the dynamics revolved around Seiji, the protagonist. While this makes sense given that the story is told from Seiji's perspective, I couldn't help but wish for a stronger sense of cohesion, especially considering that these characters were already friends with each other way before Seiji returned to the village. That being said, apart from one particular route, their presence was kept relevant throughout the whole game, something crucial to underline the strength of their bonds. Be prepared for the inevitable power of friendship spiel though, because you know how it goes when you make a group of friends face adversities. I kind of wonder if there's any visual novel out there where the protagonist basically goes, "Screw you guys, I'm going home." Anyway, moving on to their roots, I felt that the game had a very partitioned structure regarding its multiple genre approach. It was very clear when it wanted to focus, whether on the romance or on the mystery side of the story. If I'm being completely honest, I got the impression that the romance between the protagonist and the girls was there for the sake of being there. It wasn't as developed as the rest of the story, and in some routes, it gave a clear sense that it was rushed. There was one case that I found sort of amusing though, where another character acted as a matchmaker, essentially revealing both parties their mutual feelings to speed things along. On the flip side, having this pronounced shift in genre gears created a more transparent sense of pacing. You could perfectly tell what the game was trying to achieve in each plot section, while not overstaying their welcome. When it comes to the routes themselves, it's difficult to say which ones were better or worse. This is because, besides having very similar structures, the true goal of these routes was to give the player one or two pieces of the puzzle of the grand mystery. Generally speaking, it did a good job at revealing just enough to keep the reader engaged. With that in mind, I must admit that it wasn't always exactly graceful with its execution. This was particularly notable with Rui. She basically served as the info dump character. Right from her first appearance, she came across as a plot device rather than a fully fledged individual. It was especially jarring during her storyline, which started with an overly long expository conversation, followed by a romantic arc that was over in a flash, and then a quick final struggle to tie things up. The rest of the routes fared better, even if in some cases the protagonist's actions were at times impulsive and somewhat thoughtless, such as withholding crucial information from his friends that could have spared them from dangerous situations. I suppose now is as good a time as any to discuss the mystery aspect of this story. Overall, I would say I enjoyed it. There were moments that evoked a nice sense of horror and paranoia, especially during the prologue, which did a great job at building tension and intrigue. The quality of the foreshadowing, however, was all over the place. Some of it was absurdly predictable. It was hard to believe that the protagonist couldn't connect the dots right away after receiving key pieces of information. This was made more frustrating by the fact that, in some cases, it took forever for the game to, quote-unquote, reveal them. There was one scene near the end where the story referenced something plain, obviously foreshadowed in the prologue, and the shock that hit the protagonist upon hearing the truth was honestly borderline comical. Fortunately, the game also featured plenty of unexpected surprises, with some revelations that were genuinely well set up. Maybe that was the intention of the game all along, misdirecting the reader by hiding clever hints within the more obvious ones. At the same time, some of those surprises came at the cost of the story, going in a, let's say, unconventional direction. I'm not going to spoil anything, but you should at least be aware that the game seriously jumps the shark. There were also some important details that the game blatantly glosses over, as well as some story points that I wish it developed further or better contextualized within the plot's unconventional framework. Nevertheless, if you ask me, even with its wild narrative angle, I thought the overall entertainment value outweighed whatever expectations I had before playing the game. I don't think it's exactly a clever story, but it's definitely not without its own merit. There are, however, some aspects of the plot that felt clearly underdeveloped. This was notably the case with some of the sub-characters, whose inclusions, in all honesty, left me puzzled. In several cases, they appeared for quite literally just 2 scenes throughout the entire game, while having maybe less than 5 lines of dialogue in total. There was one of them in particular, with one of the most outlandish and absurd character designs I've seen in a while, who only appears for precisely 1 line of text, which, by the way, was nothing but complete silence. Even now, as I write this review, I'm still baffled by his inclusion. Was he meant to be a joke? Or maybe some sort of failed jump scare? Whatever the case, aside from this weird-ass character, there was another one who showed up only in 2 scenes, clearly for the plot's own convenience. This sort of gave the impression that the game had loftier ambitions, perhaps intending for these side characters to play larger roles. But sadly, those ambitions were never fulfilled. I also had similar feelings regarding one of its true endings, where it gave the impression that it cut off right when the final climax was about to start. The other one I liked better, even if, in some regards, was a bit of a cop-out. All things considered, when judging the overall journey, I think it still delivers a satisfying experience. While it's entirely possible that they didn't have the time, budget, or energy to complete their vision, this sense of unfinishedness wasn't present in the overarching narrative. It might not be groundbreaking or deeply refined, but it sure was fun while it lasted. As far as the writing goes, I don't think there's much to be mentioned. It gets the job done, but it's also nothing remarkable. I will say that, at first I was a bit worried, since it kept doing the old stick where the narration basically spoils future events by saying something like, "But I wasn't aware this would be the last time that I would X." But thankfully it eventually stopped doing that. Regarding the game's presentation, I found it to be decent enough, but not without its flaws. The sprites of the main cast looked quite good, although I felt like their design slightly clashed with the rural setting. They looked a bit too much like something that would appear in a shounen anime. This might be a personal bias, but I prefer visual novels set in rural Japan to have characters wearing modest clothing, like those in Heichinaku Aoi, Konosora no Shitade. Then again, I don't think they look bad or anything. Except for Rui, I think she dresses like a literal grandma. On the other hand, the side characters were quite poorly drawn, in my opinion. They felt as if they were drawn by a completely different artist. Another issue I had with the visuals had to do with one particular background that, despite being supposedly meant to represent different locations, was used too often. And as a result, it made some scenes feel disorienting. The game's engine itself also felt amateurish, for lack of a better word. Besides lacking in functions, it also did this weird thing where, whenever hovering above the text in the backlog, the cursor would change into an I-beam pointer, which was kind of distracting. In contrast, the music was quite impressive, arguably one of the strongest aspects of this visual novel. I was also pleasantly surprised by the quality of the voice acting. After checking VNDB, I found out that many of the voice actors involved barely had any roles in other titles, which baffled me because their performances here were quite strong. However, this approach of using lesser-known actors became more apparent with the minor characters, whose performances were less convincing. Also, just a quick nitpick, but aren't the yes and no buttons inverted here? It threw me off every single time.
まとめ
As a whole, Kieta Sekai to Tsuki to Shoujo offers a compelling mystery that's fun to unravel, even if some of its clues aren't particularly hard to solve. The main cast of characters and their chemistry offer a solid foundation that helps maintain the sense of tension throughout the story, making you care for their journeys. And while the story occasionally ventures into slightly eccentric territory, and some aspects, such as the romance, feel rather underdeveloped, the overall experience is more than entertaining enough to keep the readers thoroughly engaged. I give Kieta Sekai to Tsuki to Shoujo a 7.5 out of 10. And that's going to do it for this review. This one was definitely not what I was expecting, but in the end, I didn't mind it that much. There are quite a few plot points that I would have liked to discuss in this review, but I think that would be too spoilery. At any rate, I think this one makes a good inclusion to the ever-growing list of the Inaka core visual novels. Although if you want a purer Inaka experience, I think I would recommend something like Boku to Bokura no Natsu, Hateshinaku Aoi, Konosora no Shita De, or My Merry Maybe, one of the most hidden kamige out there, if I say so myself. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Mirin out.